tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome to the Early Childhood Seminar Series. We'll begin our time together with a karakia. Me noi tātou. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa ponamu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou i te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou i a tātou katoa. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. We're delighted to have you with us today for a presentation by Dr. Maggie Haggerty. In this seminar, Maggie will be focusing on one of the 6 case study children in her doctoral research. In particular, the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion Maggie observed the child encounter in his last 6 months in kindergarten and his first 6 months at school. Maggie will be offering personal reflections on the classroom and peer dynamics she witnessed, alongside interview insights provided by the child's parents, aiming to explore what we might want to do and think about differently. The recording of this presentation will be available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel after the seminar. Please do use the chat function to connect with each other and the panelists. If you have any questions for Maggie that arise in response to her presentation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask them, and Maggie will respond to them at the end of her presentation. I will now pass over to Professor Helen Hedges to welcome and introduce our speaker. Thanks, Helen.
Kia ora, Justine. Tēnā koe, Maggie. It's wonderful to have you here with us today for your presentation. And just to introduce you to those who don't know you, Maggie first qualified as a primary school teacher and spent time teaching 5.5 to 6-year-olds. However, as happened with many of us who began in primary and secondary sectors, after having a young child herself, she realised just how important the early years were and was drawn into early childhood teaching, and so studied for another teaching qualification, her early childhood one. During her time as an early childhood teacher, she worked in a number of early childhood care and education settings, including mixed age range and time with under 2s. She was very quickly, though, drawn into Wellington Teachers College, as it was then in the late 1980s, and has done a mix of teaching and professional development work, and of course more recently research when the institution changed to Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. And while she's had most of her time there, she also spent a couple of years in the United Kingdom, including time, for those who are familiar with it, at Pen Green as a relief teacher and a researcher. So Maggie's always had this interest in this interface of what happens between early childhood and primary, and really had a big concern about some of the policy and assessment changes that have started to creep in over time. So Maggie, we're really interested to hear what you have to say to us today using the example of the child from your PhD. And as Justine noted, please just pop questions into the Q&A and I'll pose them to Maggie afterwards. So over to you, Maggie. Thank you.
Kia ora, kia ora, kia ora. So te mea tuatahi kei te mihi kia kōrua ki a koutou i ngā kai whakahaere o tēnei wānanga. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the seminar series. Yeah, it's great. And thank you also to everyone who's joining it this afternoon. Ko wai au, tō airani me kōtirana o kutupuna, engari no heretanga ahau, ara kei roto I te rohe o kahungunu. Nā reira, ko te matata te poke, ko toki toki te awa, ko Ngāti kahungunu te iwi whenua. Hei pukenga ahau I te puna o Akupai ki te Herenga Waka. Ko Maggie Haggerty taku ingoa. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, yeah, as Helen says, starting school. I think, most of us are pretty aware that the focus on transition to school has really intensified in recent years, and that's amongst policymakers, but also researchers, teachers, parents and I would say children. So as Helen's explained, and in the abstract, my starting point for this kaupapa this afternoon is one child, and I'm starting with the advice of Scottish-based transitions researcher Peggy Aileen Dunlop. She's done a lot of work, research work in this space, and she writes about the importance of being alert to the uniqueness of children's transitions. So I want to speak to that. And I want to explore further this other follow-up comment she made, which was about the idea that what appears to be the apparently same transitions can for certain children be toxic. So in this presentation, as Helen said, I'm going to be focusing on the start to school of one of those case study children from my PhD research. His pseudonym in my study was Sabal. So I'm wanting to explore what it might have been about his start to school that made it for him to use Aileen Dunlop's terminology, toxic, to explore, what it might have been during Sabal's time as in a new entrant classroom that led him in the Christmas holidays when he and his parents were visiting family in India, to say that he didn't want to go back to school in New Zealand. And he was asking them, can I go to school here? Which that is in India. So in this presentation, while I am wanting to focus, on one child's start to school and to be, I get what I've said is thinking with my observation and interview witnessings to do with certain of his start to school events. I'm really not intending to ignore that, as Karen Barad puts it, existence is not an individual affair. And I very much here take inspiration from Barad's efforts to bring attention to the ways that as individuals we emerge through and as part of our entangled, to use her term, intra-relating. Well, she uses that term, intra-relating, to try to point out the ways that through those relatings, these relatings are mutually constitutive. So as she puts it elsewhere, that the entanglements that we're all part of, different entanglements, they are part of what, these reconfigure our beings, our psyches, our imaginations, our institutions, and our societies. So in a similar vein, the way that Deleuze and Guattari encourage us to engage with these sorts of entangled relatings is by thinking in terms of relations of and. So for instance, in a classroom context, for us to be on the lookout for the interplay of forces like curriculum and assessment, the policies, the priorities, the practices, but then also, children's and teachers' uniquenesses, peer relations, family dynamics, and then, physical environment, material resources. So yeah, so the and. And in a small way in this presentation, I'm looking to draw on those ideas to explore what I've called here Sabal and relations. So that's relations in and beyond the classroom, and relations that figure in what actually comes to matter. And that is for Sabal, but also beyond Sabal. And then turning to look at what alternatives we might want to consider. Okay, Sabal. So the course of Sabal's start to school took somewhat different turn to the 5 other children I followed in my PhD studies. So I'd followed them for 6 months at kindergarten, and then for the first 6 months at school. So, however, Sabal's parents, when they made the decision to send him to an out of neighbourhood school, and they later told me that the very favourable ERO ratings that the school had received for maths and for science had very much influenced their decision. For Sabal, one of the things to eventuate from this was that he knew no other children in the class that he joined. And he was also, because this was during the era of continuous entry, you know, some schools still have, you know, when children start school on or very soon after turning 5. So in his chance would have it, Sabal was the last child to join his new entrant class. All right. So moving now about 8 weeks in to Sabal's joining the new entrant class. This is a morning. The children had been learning a poem about blossoms, and they were then given the task of colouring in a blossom themed worksheet. And for this task, as with many of the classroom activities here, the children were urged to aim for star work. So in this instance, when colouring in, as it says on the slide, the children were told that for it to be star work, they were to try to colour inside the lines, use colours that make sense, and not leave any white spaces. And then the teacher added that for colouring in the blossoms on the worksheet, pink would be a sensible colour, and for the leaves, green. She repeats those messages many times and in a range of ways as she does the rounds of children's work tables. So for example, when the teacher reaches Sabal's work table, the prompting comment she makes to the first child is, "You've got the pink crayon, so you're going to be colouring in more." Child says, "Blossoms." Teacher affirms, "Blossoms." So then the teacher's attention turns a little hastily to Archie, whom you can see on this slide. He was the next of Sabal's table companions, just as he's on the point of starting to colour the face of the figure in the worksheet orange. And she quite quickly has him stop, asking, "What colour could we use instead of orange?" And then she adds, she's referring to the worksheet figure, "He doesn't have an orange face." And then she says, "You don't have an orange face, do you?" On the face of it, these comments might seem fairly innocuous. Yet as I videoed these interactions and then I later watched and rewatched them many times over, I got to thinking further about this pedagogy of sensible colours and star work. And I became increasingly concerned about what it seemed to me to be giving rise to. So here, first off, Archie responded by finding himself a white crayon. And Sabal who was listening in, reached for a crayon that, as he showed and told the teacher, was lighter. So I got to asking, I guess, or questioning a pedagogy of sensible colours, which had ended up, with brown-skinned Sabal reaching for a lighter crayon in an effort to fit in with what he takes as being looked for. And as I wrote in my thesis, the way sensible colours were being framed here in these activities, I thought could well work against children exploring real world diversity. Not all blossoms are pink or leaves green. And then too, in terms of the focus on skin colour, that got me thinking about the white Europeanness of the figure in the worksheet template, which you can see if you look closely at the slide. So this reminded me of the white-centeredness that Glenda McNaughton brought attention to when she was writing about the British-produced primary school texts that were everyday staples in her Australian schooling. McNaughton's argument was that such materials were part of the mix, so part of the and relations, I guess, helping to give rise to an unconscious conviction of, as she says here, whiteness as ordinary, of white being what was good, desirable and normal. Yeah, and then if I go back to thinking about those relations of and about the extent to which templates, the templates form such staple classroom fare, I think maybe we might want to think further on the point that John Horton and Peter Kraft all make, which I would argue is the case here, about the ways that material things, in effect, act back, that they are continually affecting and or effecting us. Something I think for us to give further consideration to. There's something else I've continued to puzzle over and really feel the need for a wider discussion. So I am hoping I do get to hear some of your thoughts on this, but it's about when the teacher said to Archie, "You don't have an orange face, do you?" This prompted me to wonder, might not this too have had the effect of inadvertently setting up Archie's white skin tone, like her, the teacher's own white skin tone, as like the norm or the standard by which he's to use to work out, what sensible colours, what's a sensible colour. I wondered, is this a sort of parallel situation to what McNaughton was suggesting, that the colour white for her had ended up getting framed as normal and desirable? Leave that and be very interested to hear your thoughts. Okay, also notable in terms of the dynamics of star work and how it played out was the role played by classmates, classroom peers, as I suggest here on the slide, as arbiters of what constituted star work. So these are two brief examples that I observed that morning. So first of all, Hian goes up to report to the teacher that Sabal is doing it fast. So in other words, not slow and careful as they were told was expected to happen in star work. And then second, Alice, and looking over at Sabal's work and grimaces and comments to her companion. And I would, it's my guess that that would have been within Sabal's hearing. That's not star work. So I think such interactions serve to highlight the important role of peers, but more particularly as the ways that, as Marek Tezar puts it, just as children are supervised and controlled, they are at the same time the controllers and supervisors of each other. So maybe this is another further aspect for us to consider further. Well, that morning mat time, I videoed 2 unsuccessful efforts on Sabal's part to make connections with classmates. So the first started with Sabal moving across the mat to sit on the floor next to one of his classmates, pseudonym Jarvis. So having watched Jarvis, raise both arms up in the air, Sabal did the same. It wasn't apparent to me why Jarvis was sitting on the floor raising his arms, because all the other children, they're still standing up and they're following the instructions of the student teacher. But what was apparent was the negative response that the camera registered when Jarvis caught sight of Sabal sitting alongside, and the look of displeasure, and these 2, not sure how to best describe them, but the sort of shove gesture, no physical contact, but yeah, getting Sabal to back off. The second episode was at the end of mat time, as the children were leaving to make their way back to their allocated work tables. And Vinny, another of the boys that Sabal had been making efforts to connect with, was lying face down on the mat. And again, Sabal did the same. Then when Vinny sits up and he discovers Sabal lying alongside, he starts tapping Sabal on his back to rouse him. Sabal rises up and he's got this sort of tentative smile on his face. And you can't see Vinny's response because his back is to the camera, but what can be seen is that it serves to shut down any further overture from Sabal as the 2 boys get to their feet and then head away. Work elsewhere has noted the way that peer exclusions operate as part of the flow of subtle, sometimes covert, and sometimes seemingly innocent actions embedded in everyday peer group interactions. So, for example, when Adam was partnered with Sabal for the beanbag dance, he studiously avoided meeting Sabal's gaze or interacting with him in any further than the dance required. And instead, he angled himself towards his 2 friends who were dancing alongside, and he was laughing and interacting with them. Then 2, with Justin's actions as table helper, when he had the task of handing out pencils to those at his work table, this too was all about the non-verbal. So he bypassed Sabal and he moved around the table and he handed one to Archie, one to Alice, and one to George, and then just as he was leaving, he rolled one across the table to Sabal. So, 6 months on, in my end of study interview with Sabal's parents, they reported Sabal telling them he had no friends and that he was being picked on by certain of his classmates during break time. They told me also of his plans to counteract this by dressing like Ben 10 and Spider-Man and putting his angry face on. Sabal's mum then went on to talk about what happened when she decided to investigate further. She said, for a few days, I went during the lunch break to pick him up, purely because I wanted to see what he does. He actually goes and hides for an hour until it's nearly time to start class, and then he comes. He hides so that he doesn't get picked on. And I felt really sad because one of the days it was raining and he was outside, I think, hiding somewhere. So by the time this interview takes place, it's the end of January. So at which point Sabal and his parents they're just back from that month-long holiday that I referred to at the beginning, where they were visiting family in India. So Sabal's dad talks about how much Sabal enjoyed joining his cousins and other children in the neighborhood play, explaining that, there it's very common. Every evening, come 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, they just go down and they play. He contrasted that with the difficulties that the family had experienced in New Zealand in terms of getting children in touch with each other. As he says, it's always an activity that needs to be created. Everything is so structured. You have to talk to the parents and they have to be monitored, and there are play dates and things like that. It's very formalized, closed. That word closed, which Sabal's dad ended with, it's one that's stayed with me. I keep coming back to the way that it seems to speak to experiences of being excluded and shut out. And it makes me ask, how might the family and Sabal's experiences have been otherwise? There is one last thing I need to talk about with this interview, my interview with Sabal's parents, is that when I asked whether they had talked to Sabal's teacher about what they had seen Sabal going through, what was happening to him, with him, they said they hadn't. And they offered me no direct answer as to why not. Okay, then. So given these events, and turning now to ask what it is that we might want to do or think about differently. So a couple of my initial questions were, what would it have taken for Sabal's parents to have felt able to raise what they saw as going on with Sabal, for Sabal? And And what would it have taken for Sabal and his uniquenesses to be met with openness? So in terms of thinking further on those entangled intra-relatings that I've tried to touch on in the presentation, you know, the out of neighbourhood school, ERO's advice, the classroom priority invested in assessment and preset specifications that I've argued were narrowing, and then classmate and family dynamics. Barad offers us, I think, some really useful questions to use. The first is to be stepping back and asking, what is it that is being made to matter, and to what effect? And the second is, you know, how are we to understand our role in helping constitute who and what comes to matter? Barad argues for this idea of an ethics of responsibility. So again, you know, she's great with these words that she reconfigures. So her way with responsibility is that play on words, is she's seeking to bring attention to what our responses are able to be. So acknowledging that actually, you know, there are limitations on what we might be able to do in our entanglements. But at the same time, you know, as many of us, I'm sure, have experienced, you know, sometimes even seemingly small actions or interventions can end up being very far-reaching in their effects. A couple of further things to consider that I believe speak to the Sabal and relations that we've looked at in the presentation. The first is the question of how might we move in the direction of inclusiveness and toward fostering what Doon calls a culture of engagement with differences. Or it's, you know, similarly, Ray Dottie terms what she terms the ethical ideal, you know, for us and for children, which, you know, being about increasing one's ability to enter into modes of relation with multiple others, both of which speak to me. I've got a postscript. It's to do with Sabal's new entrant teacher, who so very generously welcomed me into her classroom, and the white-centeredness of certain of the interactions and activities that I talked about in my analysis. It's about me remembering the many kindly, hardworking, highly thoughtful practices I witnessed in her classroom. And this compels me to add, you know, I do not believe this to be about a bad or mean teacher. And nor do I believe that it's solely about new entrant classrooms or the school sector. But it's got me wondering about, you know, how many of us who are also white skin toned would or could have just as easily done the same. And speaking for myself, I certainly think it possible. So my final thing I want to say is that thinking with these events, for me, is amongst other things, it's about, you know, trying to bring consciousness to bear on the unexamined aspects of ourselves, and pedagogical priorities that we take on and we get entangled by, and maybe without enough critical scrutiny or even resistance. So it's about us helping ourselves and helping each other to come to see what is intentionally or unintentionally coming to matter, and to what effect. Kua mutua hau. So thank you so very much for your time and attention.
Kia ora, Maggie. Motu kōrero. Wow, you've given us so much to think about. Your focus on Sabal has illustrated many matters of inclusion, diversity, pedagogy, and definitely around children's peer relationships. So these are all things we all need to puzzle on, to use your word, in a lot more depth as we engage with our own work and our advocacy in our communities. So yes, there were a few people commenting that they've got very sad about Sabal's situation, and so that's a really important starting point, as you've said, for thinking differently. And we have one question so far, and there may be more coming, and that's from D.T. Hill, who wanted to know a little bit more about the teacher's role, because, as she said, you've concentrated on Sabal and his experience, and in the postscript you've said she was very generous about sharing her space with you and welcoming you in. What we would like to hear a little bit more about, though, is what was it that this teacher was noticing and recognising and possibly responding to in relation to Sabal?
Yeah, well, I think my sense was that her focus was, in terms of the STAR work, trying to make transparent to the children what expectations were. You know, she was working really hard to make that clear. I mean, it's something in the assessment sort of literature, advice to teachers, you know, that sort of clarity of, you know, what outcomes are being looked for. And in our tertiary education space, same, that we make these things transparent. And I think she was working really hard to do that. But I think maybe it was at the expense of seeing quite how that was landing for, you know, and let's face it, you know, one teacher, the number of children, and all of the demands in that space for where children, you know, where they start when they come in, and the expectations of where they need to be after 6 months, particularly in terms of, you know, like reading, literacy, numeracy, things. I think, you know, this was also during the time of national standards, you know, so I think, so here's this experienced and in many respects, you know, so highly thoughtful teacher.
Right, so what you're saying is she was noticing, recognising, responding to what she felt was important about learning and assessment in that environment, and perhaps not so much on this particular child, which kind of reminded me of Sally Peters has picked up on Pat Thompson's phrase of the virtual backpack. And, you know, what children bring to school with them and whether or not that is recognised. Are you able to comment on that, given that you did know him through the end of his early childhood experience? You know, was there something that was picked up on or not? You know, what was going on for him?
Well, I think, I mean, it is like, I think, you know, the entanglement for me helps to understand some things. Like, I think, you know, her, for example, entangled in the expectations on her as a teacher to get these children to a certain point. Then there's also things like, you know, him being the last child in to an already established classroom. And we all know numbers, and some, you know, I mean, I'm sure there are classrooms with, you know, worse ratios, but, you know, she had a full class. He came in last. A lot was already established. So all of those dynamics, I think, start to come into play together. And I don't know, does that sort of help? it's that coming together of all those different factors. So I guess that's why I'd say we don't go back to the individual teacher and sort of as holding her accountable, because I think, you know, we'd be, it's sort of more complex. So
yes, there's so much more going on, as you've explained, with the interactive activity and the and that was very, very, very clear. Okay, we've got a question from someone who's much closer to you than us physically at the moment, geographically. Jenny Ritchie wants to know what the implications there are for teacher educators.
For teacher educators, right. Well, I think for me, I mean, it was interesting, Helen, you were saying about the feeling of sadness or what Sabal had gone through. And I know, like, Peter Moss talks about calling on educators to be open-hearted, open-minded, and that really resonates for me. You know, I think that in the space, in our education space at the moment, I think there's a lot of attention on sort of learning and so on. I think to some extent we are in danger of losing sight of those human child, not as learner, but child, as fellow human being. All of those things I think are extremely precious, part of our kaupapa in early childhood. And I think in teacher education spaces, it's important for us to try and encourage people to be holding on to that. So that's, I also feel in terms of, you know, the resistance with another sort of thing, you know, just, being critical about what comes, you know, I just think about what teachers have had sort of to ingest, you know, the amount over time. And so trying to be realistic about what they can do, but at the same time, you know, like trying to sort of look at places where, you know, you sort of say, oh, I might look at a different way of doing that.
I think those are really good reminders to us, because we've often seen, you know, and traditionally ready for school was one thing, and all of this debate around school readiness is very much getting back to that cognitive academic focus that you've explained that the teacher was interested in. Whereas, yes, there's so much more around well-being and belonging that teacher educators can be reminded of. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, I think, I mean, I would like to pay tribute to Sally Peters too, with her work on friends and friendship and how incredibly important that is, because I think, you know, she's done a great job in forefronting that.
Yes, for sure, and you brought that out today too, with the examples of him going to a school where he didn't know anyone, and those efforts to make friends that were being rejected. So yes, we have a question from Kevin who wants to know: can you explain a little bit more, or perhaps if his parents talked to Sabal at home about the experiences he was having and what advice they were giving to him?
It was quite difficult terrain to get a sense of what was going on at home. I mean, like, I was surprised they hadn't raised it with the teacher, but I at the same time wasn't sure how to sort of, whether it was okay to probe further, or, you know, I sort of left it. I mean, they had theories. Sabal's dad talked about the fact that because he came in so late, everybody else there was sort of set up, and he was saying, you know, they were quite comfortable, and that didn't really help him to find his feet there. They were saying they hadn't really realized it was going to be so difficult for him to go into a place where he knew no one, and the whole friends thing being so important. They just hadn't really seen that. I think they also, he had, I don't know, he was their first child. They had another wee boy. They were sort of feeling perhaps he could be more resilient. I actually think Sabal was pretty amazing myself. But but I could see that, you know, I got that sense that they were still seeing that their second child could also face challenges, you know, in becoming to belong at school.
Right. And yes, you're kind of referring to some of those ethical boundaries that you don't quite traverse as a researcher, because we have another question from Georgina saying, did you feel like discussing with parents the choice of school, or, you know, maybe looking at a different one? And I expect the answer is probably no, but you can comment on that in a minute. But if they had a second child, do you think they would make the same choice? Perhaps that's the interesting.
Well, I haven't asked them. I mean, I have gone back to them because, you know, this is a little while ago now, and, you know, in terms of using this material, I've gone back a couple of times to have conversations with them, because I think as children get older, you're sort of worried that they, you know, then things might shift. And I don't actually know whether their younger boy, you know, are they at the same school? That's a really good question.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think perhaps the fact that Sabal's there as an older brother would make quite a different thing. And, you know, at the end of that year, they were saying one of their things was, oh, well, we hope for him to be making some better friends next year. And I was thinking, me too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, interesting. And still just keeping with the school experience.
Yeah.
Deborah Wansborough, who you also know well,
Deb,
wants to know, was what happened at school a contrast to his early childhood service? And she has part two of a question. Do you think cohort entry would help children to find friends? So the contrast or not between early childhood and school, and then the cohort entry.
Yeah, well, there was a contrast. I think at his kindergarten, yeah, I mean, he was, you know, he did struggle to make connections with children, but I think it was, you know, there were places and spaces and activities and interests that he shared with others that became sites of connection. So, yeah, so he was very much into construction. So he would make these incredible sort of things. And one of the teachers was great. She was like, you know, sometimes he'd make himself costumes that were just amazing. And she would say, well, we were a bit worried that it would actually maybe not hold together all that well, you know, and you'd be trying to sort of get him to maybe make it a little bit securer and so on. But he was always very happy with, you know, what he'd come up with. And he truly, yeah, that sort of creativity side of it. So again, I think it's coming back to the materials. He didn't, I mean, I once saw him playing with blocks in the classroom. And then I think the teacher's comment was something about, you know, asking what he was making, or I don't know. It was just, yeah, it was tricky. So yeah, there was a contrast. I think there was much more opportunity for him to connect in spaces and places and activities for him to connect in with in the kindergarten setting.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, of course, that one of his strategies for making friends he talked to his parents about was to dress like, what did you say, Ben 10 or
Ben 10, yeah.
So that's probably something he'd learned from peers at kindergarten. And now you've told us about making the costumes. So
yeah,
yes, he's still very much got his backpack of skills about how do you make a friend, and he's very resilient and trying very hard. Okay, now what about the cohort entry? What's your thought?
Yeah, well, the cohort entry is interesting, isn't it? Like clearly his dad felt cohort entry would have helped because he would have gone in with a group rather than on his own. And I do tend to think, you know, that would have helped. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's, whichever way you go, you probably get some pluses and some minuses. But yeah, I just think, and even for the teacher, having just a slightly bigger group of newbies, maybe that, you know, that would have helped. I mean, she was amazing in trying to sort of, you know, inculcate, you know, Sabal into classroom stuff. But
really?
he was only one, you know, and everyone else was sort of on deck with a lot of that stuff. So it's sort of like, yeah, it is really interesting. I suspect it might help.
Yeah. And you described how did you describe his peers as arbiters of what constituted good work, rather than people, small people who were becoming his friend or wanted to become his friend. So yes, when you're trying to balance those different requirements and expectations, on everybody's part. It is interesting. So yes, it'll be great to see your research in the future on cohort entry then. See how that goes. Alison Warren's got a really interesting question about your use of interaction and response ability.
Right.
So of course, from her work too, those concepts are really powerful.
Yeah,
so she asks, can you imagine a school classroom or early childhood centre where these concepts could be worked with by kaiako and tamariki, including the second part of the questions? Do you think there are ways that you could kōrero with tamariki that use interaction and responsibility in ways that they would understand?
Wow, that's a great question, Alison. I've been trying to, like this presentation, I was thinking, I find them quite difficult concepts to explain to anybody. First of all, getting my own head around it, and as best I can. And I'm not saying I've got it perfect by any stretch, but yeah. So that, and then like working, because working at Te Herenga Waka with student teachers, and really, because I am passionate about these ideas. I do think they are great tools to think with, because they help you to engage with the complexity of stuff. But I do find them difficult to, I like eye rolling when you sort of get into the theoretical realm, it worries me. So maybe we should have a little cohort of passionados about these ideas and share ways that people, are working with them, because I'm very, very interested in them as conceptual tools, which I think they're great.
Yes, and they would certainly help kaiako and tamariki, and obviously in different ways and perhaps at different levels, to come to terms with some of the complexities that they experience that you described so well today. So it just remains for me now to say thank you so much for your presentation today. As I said, you've given us such a lot to ponder on and puzzle and think about in terms of how perhaps we think about all children's schooling experiences too. And that, the experiences of one child are so powerful, because you wanted us to be alert to the uniqueness of children's transitions, and you've illustrated that so well with Sabal. And I also wrote down that this was part of the whole interaction and complexity. You wanted to talk about ways that policies, practices, priorities, peer relations, family dynamics, physical environments, and material resources combine. And we had seen that so well in the individualist experience of this particular child. So I'm sure that you've sent several people off to look at the other 5 children in your study, and I know that your PhD is available online, and it has hyperlinks to videos, so that's even more illustrative of the situations that you found. And if people don't want to read a whole PhD, you've got a number of other publications, and I know there's one in Global Studies in Childhood. I think you wrote that with Sophie Alcock, is that right?
Yes.
So.
I've done with Judith Loveridge and Sophie, and one in the Video Journal, which covers some of this material.
And the one I was thinking of is really very much around policy and assessment.
Oh yes,
which has been the focus of what you've talked about today. So
thank you.
Again, kia ora, motu mahi and motu kōrero tēnā wā. Yes, back to you, Justine. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Maggie, for sharing with us this evening. The transition from an early childhood setting into the school sector is such a time of mixed emotions for children and families. And as you've illustrated tonight, it can be an incredibly vulnerable time. And what you've shared with us speaks to the importance of communication, having a sense of belonging, and as always, the centrality of responsive and reciprocal relationships during this time of transition. I'm sure that this provocation is going to act as a provocation for those in the early childhood and the school sectors to think more deeply about transition processes and how those can be further developed to ensure belonging and inclusion for all children. So ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to everybody here. It's lovely. it's just, yeah, it's been great. Thank you. I've enjoyed it, which I didn't think I would. I get very anxious about such things, but it's been great. Thank you.
Well, it has been our absolute pleasure to have you here with us, Maggie. To everybody in our audience, if you wish to share or revisit Maggie's presentation, then please do check out our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. The recording of the seminar will be available in a couple of days, and we look forward to seeing you all back for our next seminar, which will be at the end of October. So keep an eye on your inbox for the flyer and registration information for that. But thank you again for joining us this evening. Kia tau tō rangimārie e, ki runga i ngā iwi o te ao. Let your peace reign on all the people of the world. Kia kaha, kia ora, kia atawhai, ka kite anō.